Welcome to this video. Today I have a very special guest. He has been with us in an interview about 3 years ago and has shared a lot of hands-on tips on coffee roasting. This video was so popular that it has been viewed about 50,000 times. And therefore, I'm super happy that we can do a follow-up and that he is here again. So welcome, Rob House.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here, Ingo.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for coming. And maybe to explain for those few people who don't know you yet, who you are, maybe you can quickly introduce yourself. What is your way in coffee roasting, and then what are you offering or what are you doing?
Yeah. So I'm a coffee roasting consultant. I specifically work on people's roast profiles, roasting machine setups, coffee purchases, that sort of side of the industry. So very specific and very niche. But I'm also a published author. I've gotten a number of books out about coffee roasting. And just kind of various approaches to how to roast coffee. I run a few online communities and mentorship groups as well for people who are coffee roasters, as well as teach online classes. I was part of the SCAA to SCA transition, so I helped with the education side of the SCA for a number of years, actually. And yeah, just kind of been around for a hot minute doing roasting and roasting adjacent things.
Good, great. What I really love about you, and then also all the research and books you're doing, is like you're a person who is not taking things for granted. Your researches, but also what's out there on knowledge and coffee roasting, and you're always questioning and want to get further and new information. And therefore, maybe to start with, like in about the 3 years that has been the last time that we've talked, what have been your biggest learning? What did you discover about roasting? Were there some new things that you found or came up with?
Yeah, I mean, so many things have changed even in the last 3 years. So, I mean, for one, massive focus for me has been on cultivated variety. So looking at what cultivar is being used in a particular either field blend or even as a single origin, single cultivar coffee. And just looking at how to approach roasting those differently, because in the industry, we've not really, like, we'll pay attention if it's just 100% Gesha or 100% Chiroso or Pink Bourbon or something like that. But then a lot of the other coffees that we're working with, we don't really pay too much attention to what's in the mix and how that impacts the flavor of the coffee and how it impacts how we should approach roasting it. And so that's been one of my massive changes, is just like an absolute focus on what cultivars are present and which ones are the predominant ones within a blend, or if it's a single cultivar, which one is there, what should I expect flavor profile wise, and how should I expect to approach roasting it. Other big learnings for me has been around airflow. Historically, I've always been of the opinion that airflow was just one method of heat transfer, and so whatever your airflow was, it didn't really change flavor a huge amount. Totally disagree with that now. I've done some experiments, some like really like honed in experiments on airflow. And one of the things that I found that was really exciting is not only does airflow actually taste different, but there is a observable change in the weight loss curve of the coffee when you're using different airflow settings on a roasting system. And we're primarily talking about traditional drum roasters, or even higher airflow drum roasters, because for those who are new to seeing me on here, the Loring itself is an is a drum roaster because it uses mechanical agitation. So that's the big differentiation between fluidized bed, or what we often call air roasters, and traditional drum roasters, which are going to be using mechanical agitation, usually in the shape of a drum. So within the realm of traditional drum roasters, airflow makes a massive impact. It does in fluidized bed roasting too, but most of my research has been more on drum roasting. So those have been like the two major things that just really get me excited. So
nice.
Yeah.
Then when you, I mean, we were here to deep dive a little bit into cultivar, but of course you then get me with all the topics that you were throwing in the room. When you're talking about airflow or different airflow settings, are you then mainly talking about drum speed, or then really like airflow, how it's being like the speed of the airflow that you can set on the drum roaster?
Yeah. Yep. Yeah. Mostly talking about the speed of the airflow, although you're absolutely right in that the drum speed does change the convection conduction ratios inside of the roasting system. But the research is specifically around how much airflow you're moving through and what that does to the inlet air temperature and the exhaust air temperature, and how all that kind of interrelates.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
I was super curious about that as well. And then the other thing, Cultivar, where you can even publish the book. I have it actually here. Really nice, great. Also, again, a really hands-on book. But is it like, why did you start your focus on Cultivar? Was there like an event or a frustration, or was it just an idea that you said it's actually something that is a little bit overlooked, or how did you start or came up with it?
Yeah, it was a mix of things, I think. So on the one hand, the way that I was brought up in specialty coffee, the way that I was taught by early mentors, and even just by the industry's understanding of things in general, was at first it was like, okay, well, processing is a huge impact on flavor profile. Country of origin is an impact on flavor profile, because back then too, country of origin meant very specific things about what cultivars were available, how they were processed, and infrastructure issues would cause certain flavor profiles to come out. So like 10, 15, 20 years ago, people would say like, oh, this tastes like a Colombian, and that meant something. Whereas now, because of the advent of the internet and how it's kind of democratized information, trading of cultivars, trading of practices through different areas, you can have a cultivar from anywhere in the world being grown anywhere else in the world, and they could be following a processing methodology that's totally different than they used to historically in that area. And so, back when I was first taught, it was like, oh, processing method and country of origin are the two biggest things about flavor. And the reason for country of origin was because of terroir, this French word that we throw around all the time because it sounds really cool and classy. And terroir was the biggest thing after processing that really impacted the flavor. And, I would every once in a while hear people say like, oh, I can tell that this is a Bourbon based on the flavor, but that wasn't, something that I had experienced. And so as I continued growing in my roasting, I started running into cultivars that just did stuff that didn't really make sense. And I think one of the bigger eye-opening ones to me was a Maragogype from Papua New Guinea, from Vikram, who runs Benchmark Coffee Traders here in the US. It was a Maragogype from Sigiri Estate, who he works very closely with. And you have ideas in your head when you think of Papua New Guinea, right? If you're trained in this old school way of certain cultivars and certain origins taste a certain way, and Papua New Guinea for me was always like spiced, earthy, chocolatey, heavy-bodied, all this sort of stuff. And I end up with this Maragogype from Vikram, and it's nothing like that. It's insanely different. It's just a wash. There's no weird fermentation stuff happening or anything like that, but it tastes like tropical fruit. It's super floral. It's extremely tea-like. And the reason I got to that place was I was doing iteration box sets with it, which before starting work on the cultivar project, the iteration box sets that I was doing was basically just an exploration. I would buy a particular coffee and I would roast it every different way I could think of. And I would figure out which one tasted the best out of all those approaches. And then I would present that to the group. And they would get a box that had all the different versions of the roasting that I did, as well as the one I thought was the best. And they'd get a little book inside of it, and they'd be able to look through it and taste everything along with it. And it was a really fun experience for all of us. It was like these curated tasting sets. And the Maragogype, I had been taught classically, you need to roast those really slow. They're really delicate. You don't want to push them too hard because you're going to end up with these negative flavor attributes. I had also been taught that Maragogype tended to be spicy, savory, and dull, right? And here I end up with this Maragogype that was vibrant, juicy, bright, floral, absolutely crazy flavors because I roasted it really, really fast. And I started looking at the details of Maragogype, and Maragogype being a mutation of Typica, which Typica I've always roasted fast. Maragogype is a single gene mutation that basically causes like gigantism in Typica. And it roasted better, or it tasted better when I roasted it like I was roasting a Typica. And that kind of started me on this train of thought of like, I've been told this whole time that, cultivar matters for certain ones. Like Gesha obviously is it's really important, or Shirosa or Pink Bourbon or whatever. But I never really thought about the fact that, every single coffee is bringing something genetically to the table, and it might be better to roast it in a particular way versus another way. And maybe there's a predictable pattern to that. And so I started taking the iteration box sets in a very particular direction, in that I would buy from a single farm as many cultivars as I could from that farm processed the same way. And so at one point, there was one farm that it was looking like I was going to get 16 cultivars from, and that one just ended up thankfully coming down to 8, because 16 would have been something that would have probably been way too much for me to handle. 8 was kind of at the cusp of how many I could handle doing a box set version of that, because what I ended up settling on was a baseline roast profile and an optimized roast profile for each. And so for 8 coffees, people ended up getting 16 bags of coffee to taste along with me, as well as a book write-up that had all the information in it. So it ended up being a ton of work. But what I found over time, as I was investigating one farm, as many cultivars as they had, all wash process if I could handle it. I did do one farm that was primarily natural process because that's what they had, and it was a very interesting experiment as well. We could talk about that later. But what I started finding was the cultivar tasted the same regardless of whether it was grown in Papua New Guinea or whether it was grown in Latin America. The actual terroir didn't seem to matter as much, or the place didn't seem to matter as much, as long as the cultivar was the same and their approach to processing it was the same. And so that just set me off on this whole like whirlwind of experimentation and documentation and writing. The documentation for the book Cultivar, we were talking about before we started the podcast, but it's a book I call Field Notes, but it's about 586 pages, and it's basically just all the documentation of the roasting that I did to prepare the cultivar project. So that's a really long-winded answer to your question, but that's kind of what took me down that road and where I ended up going with it.
Yeah, it's super interesting. And in one end, I think it's also a little bit funny, because if you're eating different apples, then you realize that the taste is really different. If you're drinking wine, there is really like common to go into different grapes. And with coffee, we don't really have that concept. Of course, we say which cultivar it is then usually, but we're not really that deep into all those like taste or flavor differences or then roasting approaches. What do you think? Why is this tradition a bit missing in coffee, or why are we focused so much on other aspects?
Yeah, I was having a great conversation with someone who's been in the industry for a long time yesterday, and something that they said that I thought was really poignant is really like, it was around the 2000s when we really started kind of pushing the envelope in specialty coffee toward a more scientific jaunt. Like before then, it was just kind of like, you roasted coffee, and there were people who were really, really good at roasting coffee, and there were people who were not as good at roasting coffee, but why? We didn't really know.
Yeah.
There wasn't as much rigor. And even when I first started, like part of the reason I first wrote modulating, almost 11 years ago now, was there were a lot of people I'd run into at trade shows and stuff like that. They were stuck on talking about coffee as an art form. And they would talk about, which it is 100%, coffee roasting is also an art form, but they were talking about it exclusively as such. And that like, oh, do you remember back in August of last year when we had that really good version of this coffee? And it's like, it shouldn't be a one-time deal. It shouldn't be like, if that one time we had a great coffee from this batch and then the rest of it was just okay.
Yep.
Like there should be some sort of repeatability and some sort of metric that we can understand how to adapt the flavor of the coffee to get what we're looking for. And so I think that really just we're a newer industry, specialty coffee is, in the grand scheme of life.
Yeah. So we're always discovering new things. But you also mentioned then terroir. And when it comes to terroir, I mean, of course, we talk a little bit about soil or climate, but a lot is then also about altitude. So this is like very typical concept. And I'm sometimes also, when because I'm measuring, of course, density and all that with all coffees, I'm sometimes a bit struggling in finding really like following this path of this like the easy descriptions out there. What do you think on terroir and altitude? Like what is in your experience then good descriptions or good factors for that influence the quality of a coffee when it comes to terroir?
Yeah, and so this is where it does get a little challenging. So when I'm drawing allusions to like, oh, the coffee that I got from Papua New Guinea and the coffee I got in Central America tasted really close or almost the same because they were the same cultivar, they're also grown at similar altitudes, right? And so that is a big thing. So there are a couple aspects of terroir that I do think are important. I do think that altitude plays a massive role in terms of the flavor profile of coffee, but not because of altitude. Like the coffee plants don't have an altimeter on them, and they're like, oh, we're 1,201 meters above sea level, so we had better, act like we're strictly hard bean now suddenly.
Yeah.
But it has to do with the light that they're receiving, the temperature swings that they're getting, and how productive the tree is. So the less productive the tree, the slower the maturation of the fruit on the tree, typically the better the flavor of the coffee. Higher altitude tends to do that, but it's not a surefire like one-to-one. It's correlation, not causation. And one great example of that is, I don't remember 3 years ago, had I had that Galápagos coffee, the coffee from Galápagos, and talked to you about that yet?
No, I don't remember.
Super trippy. So I was able to get through Caravella coffee, a coffee from the Galápagos Islands.
Yeah.
And it was grown at 200 meters above sea level. Extremely low altitude. It was a Typica and Bourbon blend. And it was every bit as dense as some of the natural processed Kenyan coffees that I was buying at the time, despite being 200 meters above sea level versus Kenya, which is baseline like about 1,500.
Yeah.
And so the reason for it, though, is because in the Galápagos, the ocean currents help to keep everything nice and temperate and cool. So even with a low altitude, the temperature was a lot more similar to what those coffee plants were experiencing at altitude. And so it was lower producing coffee trees, slower maturation rate. And as a result, we had really dense coffee that also tasted absolutely stunning. And so, altitude's not a surefire thing in terms of like, oh, higher altitude will be better, and lower altitude will be worse. But most of the time, higher altitude coffee does tend to be better, and lower altitude coffee does tend to be a little bit lower in quality. So that's where that comes in. Now, other parts of terroir that I think are really interesting, the microbiome of the area that you're in, right? So the microbiome, we think about it in terms of fermentation. And so with fermentation tanks, that's definitely part of it, because most people are doing wild or natural fermented coffee.
Yeah.
And because of that, whatever yeast or bacteria are present in their environment are going to be what's working in the fermentation tank, unless they're actively dosing it or isolating it or controlling the fermentation somehow. So the local, I guess, terroir of the microbiome for that is going to be important. There's also microbes in the soil that are going to be breaking down the nutrients that the coffee trees can then uptake through the root system. And so whatever microbes you have in your soil are also going to be part of the terroir that are going to be impacting coffee quality. So, the one thing I want to be careful not to ever say is that terroir doesn't matter, because it does to a certain extent. It's just that the flavor of coffee, as we come to think of it, I think is more controlled by the processing method and the cultivar. And then to make it good coffee, we have to have all the other right elements of terroir present. So, but then in terms of like whether it's clay-based soil or ash volcanic soil or what, those sorts of things I don't know anything about, and I don't know how much those would impact the actual flavor if we were able to isolate those variables.
Okay. Will be next book then.
Not for me. I think that's way outside of my wheelhouse, but yeah.
But what do you think then when it comes to cultivar, like now if as a roaster I want to focus on cultivars, how sure can I be that I really then get this and that cultivar from a specific region? I mean, because they're like, how sure are then the producers, or is there also a possibility that there have been like cross-pollinations or like misclassifications or so? What is like a bit your experience here?
Yeah, I will say that the research points to, and I'll cite Dr. Monaghan from RD2 Vision France, who does genetic testing on coffee trees. They were telling me that there's about 25% cross-pollination that happens despite coffee being auto-pollinating.
Yeah.
There are cross-pollinations that happen. And then in the book 21st Century Coffee, a guide by Kenneth Davids cites there being about 20% cross-pollination. So in any given lot, if you have a pure Gesha, for example, about 20% of those seeds in your pure Gesha lot are very potentially Gesha mixed with whatever else is around. If you're growing Gesha in the middle of a Gesha field, okay, well then you're probably pretty sure that it's all Gesha. But if you're growing Gesha right next to Caturra, okay, well then maybe 20 to 25% of the seeds might have some Caturra genetics in them, which is going to impact the flavor a little bit because just the genetics are different. The other question you asked, which I think is great, is like, do they know what they have? And a lot of times, no. Like, as best as they can, they do. A lot of coffee farmers are pretty certain about the generic amounts of different things that they have. But a lot of coffee producers that are, don't have their own like large farms, or they're getting seeds from different seed banks or something like that, they're really trusting the people that they're getting stuff from to be truthful and to know what they're buying from them. You also have various things of I don't want to say espionage because I think that's making it a little grandiose, but people share cultivars even sometimes when they're not supposed to, or they take them from one place to another, maybe when they're not supposed to. And so you don't ever really know 100%. But I think that taking the information you're given and understanding the likelihood of what you have can help you get to a better roasting situation faster than not knowing at all or not taking it into account. So even if you're buying a lot that's 100% Typica, but it's actually really only 80% Typica, you're still going to land at a better place following certain guidelines faster than you would if you took a totally different approach to roasting them. Would be my take. But a fun quick story that I have. So one of the first box sets we did, I did buy more coffee from Vikram from Sagiri Estate to do some testing for the cultivar project. And one of the coffees they had on their farm, they were referring to as SL-R. And I asked about it, and they're like, well, it was a cultivar that somebody for a long time ago bought from Kenya and brought to Papua New Guinea and planted. And so SL, Scott Laboratories, that kind of designation, like SL28, SL34, said SLR. And I was like, never heard of SLR, couldn't find any information about it anywhere. And I was like, is it Ruiru? Was there misunderstanding? And so it's Ruiru 11, but they just called it SL because they thought it's from Kenya, so it's an SL. What's going on? So we did actually take some of that coffee and sent it to RD2 Vision in France, to Dr. Monaghan. And I really hope I'm pronouncing their name properly. Anyway, RD2 Vision, you should check out their website. They've got some really cool resources there. But the genetic testing came back and it was Castillo. And so in Castillo, from when I heard in 2015 a talk at the Nordic Roaster Forum from one of the gentlemen from Colombia that helped found the Castillo project there, that's not supposed to be outside of Colombia. That's supposed to be in Colombia only because Colombia developed it for itself. So the best anybody can figure is this particular coffee was brought from Colombia into Kenya, probably for their breeding projects there. Maybe with approval from the Colombian government, maybe not, who knows? But it ended up in Kenya. Somebody else got a hold of it during the time that it was in Kenya. So it got out of the lab, basically, which sounds like some sort of weird start to a zombie story. Got out of the lab and ended up being sold down to Papua New Guinea as a Kenyan cultivar.
Yeah.
When it wasn't at all.
So, nice.
But
yeah. But now let's assume now as a roaster, I know what I'm buying and I know the cultivar I get and I want to now treat it correctly. So when we go into that, you like the findings you had, you kind of categorize the cultivars in 4 groups. How do you came up with these groups, or what do they have?
So the 4 groups, 3 of them kind of have a similar approach to roasting, and then one of them has more of a similar approach to just like conceptualizing it. So the 3 groups are the Typica group, Bourbon group, and the Ethiopian group. And then the outlier one is kind of the hybridized group, or the Hybrido Timor group. And the reason for kind of going with those categorizations is just kind of how the genetic tree unfolds. And so, generally speaking, if something has a Bourbon orientation, there's a certain way I approach roasting it. And it gets me better results more quickly. If something has a Typica orientation, I usually approach that. If it's a blend of them, I kind of have to figure out which part of the genetics is in the driver's seat, sort of thing. With Ethiopian heirloom cultivars, there's too many of them for me to like really go into each one. And so it's kind of like this general approach has worked, and here's a whole bunch of Ethiopian cultivars that I've worked with that this has done a good job with. The Hybrido de Timor ones are a little bit different because the Timor hybrid, I haven't ever gotten to roast pure. And so I can't say for certain like, oh, well, the Timor hybrid likes to be roasted X way. But what I found is that coffees that have the Timor hybrid in it, if I look at what else is in the mix and roast according to that, then it tends to work out well. And so the Hybrido de Timor mix, it's not that there's like a consistent roast profile amongst all those coffees in there, but it's like, okay, it's Hybrido de Timor plus Caturra. Okay, well, I'm going to roast it a certain way. Whereas if it's Hybrido de Timor plus Rume Sudan, as in the case of Centro Americano or H1 cultivar, I'm going to take a very different approach. So even though those are both in that one same category, they both have different approaches in terms of the timings, but the conceptual approach is the same, which is I'm looking at what else is married with Hybrido de Timor before I go into roasting it.
Okay. Can we have a look a little bit about those 4 groups, and then what's particular for each group, or like how you would approach them then?
Yeah, I mean, so generally speaking, you know, if you're dealing with a cultivar that is Bourbon oriented, it's probably going to enjoy a slightly slower style of roasting than one that's in the Typica group or in the Ethiopian group. Both of those are going to tend to prefer slightly faster styles of roasting to the ones in the Bourbon group. And I think that that's, you know, there is this issue that we run into in coffee where, you know, especially in the modern trends, where everybody thinks faster is better.
Yep.
And, you know, and there's this stylistic move toward like, I want to roast really fast. I want to roast really fast. It doesn't always work out the best, if I'm being perfectly honest. There are some cultivars that don't do as well with super fast styles of roasting. Doesn't mean you can't do an ultra light roast on them. It just means you can't do an ultra fast roast on them, and have them turn out as well as they could have otherwise. And so I think that there are blind spots in our industry because we're approaching everything in a very homogenized way. And so our preferences have shifted as a result. And so I see this a lot just in my own experience, like working with clients as a consultant, where, you know, people are shifting toward enjoying more Ethiopian oriented cultivars like Pink Bourbon, Shiroso, Gesha, like all these really fancy exotic ones. They're like, oh, these are really good. But it makes sense because those all work with the faster style of roasting that people think they need to be doing if they're doing an ultralight. Whereas a classic Caturra doesn't. You throw a classic Caturra in and profile it like it's a Gesha, it's not going to come out well. It's going to be very papery, it's going to be very thin, and it's not going to have any sort of complexity. It's just going to be kind of like, whatever. Whereas if you roast that Caturra the way that Caturra enjoys being roasted, with a slightly slower style of roasting, you're going to get the complexity. The body's going to show up. It's going to be really full. There's going to be a lot of complexity to it. But if you roasted the Gesha the way you roast the Caturra, it's not going to go well. Yeah. It's actually going to taste really savory and opaque and heavy and muddled. And so, you know, that's where it becomes really important to kind of like figure out where things fit within this paradigm and how to approach roasting them, I guess, is the long and short answer of it. Did that answer your question?
No. I mean, I think that's a great answer, because this is a bit like, what we are looking for, of course, then as a roaster, so that we get a bit an orientation on which coffees to roast how. And you said a bit like the Typica, like the ones in the Typica groups and in the Ethiopian groups, you would roast a little bit faster, and they then really match also with this faster roast style, or one a bit slower. I mean, of course, then also if people want to really deep dive, they can then look for each cultivar, then like your approach. But is it a bit like, do you have an idea where it's coming from? Is it like a bit with the sugar content, or is it related, or is it just like you just tried and then you found out that it's working well with the faster or a slower general roasting approach?
Yeah, in terms of what's triggering it physiologically or chemically, I've not been able to find that in additional research.
Yeah.
What's interesting is it doesn't seem to be stuck on any one shape. For example, Maragogype is a very different shape than a classic Typica or Gesha, and yet they all prefer this faster style of roasting. So it doesn't seem to be derived on the physical shape, so I would guess it has something to do with the chemistry of it.
Yeah.
The other thing that I need to revisit now and want to revisit now is that in combination with the work I've been doing on airflow. Are there differences in terms of how their weight loss profiles run that are going to help make sense of some of these things? So, there's some interesting things I think to investigate. And so this is definitely more of a practical book than it is I've found the answer of why sort of thing. Yeah.
Now we talked about cultivar, but there is then also like the processing coming into play with that. And do you think there are processing methods that suit certain cultivars a bit more than others?
Yeah, so I don't know that there's some that suit a particular cultivar better than the other. In terms of like natural process versus wash process or honey, when I was working through all these different cultivars, one of the things I experienced was like I could still tell it was a Caturra, or I could still tell it was a Bourbon or a Typica, even despite the processing. I will say the caveat to that being that I do think that natural process and honey processed coffees that are of the Catamore group, or the Sarchimore group even, I do think that those have a really high tendency to taste better than the washed coffees for certain people. Like I've worked with a farm in Guatemala before where the Sarchimores were just kind of okay, but their natural Sarchimores were like really good. And so same with the honey Sarchimores. Now, that being said, is it because of my proclivities toward wanting fruitiness in coffee? Probably. Is it possible that the natural Sarchimores just did a better job with the faster roasting style because they had more interesting notes? And if I went back and revisited it and roasted the way that I would now probably approach roasting a Sarchimore, would I come up with a different result? Maybe, but I would say that, if you're dealing with a Catamore, sometimes natural or honey processed versions of that taste a little bit better or more interesting than the straight up washed ones. But in terms of like a natural Gesha versus a regular Gesha, or a natural Caturra versus a regular Caturra, I think that they all taste great. I think that the processing is really just kind of adding onto the top of it when it's done well.
Interesting. And then also then talking about processing and cultivars, because as a roaster, I'm always trying to find kind of easy solutions or way to, approach coffee in a way that I get the best out of it, and then it gets more and more complex. So, I mean, we're all, of course, talking about processing and then density, maybe also a little bit about moisture is also an important topic. And now we also have cultivar. So what would you recommend now a roaster in order to approach this within this field of different factors to find the right roasting profile? Or is it like, I don't know, a priority list, or what would be your practical recommendation to now approach a certain coffee?
I would say, the biggest guiding star for people should be why they bought the coffee in the first place. And so like if you're purchasing a coffee for espresso, and you're selling it to people who just do milk-based drinks and they have a certain flavor profile they're expecting, that has to really guide your whole process. If, I know the general Roast Rebels clientele as well. So I most people are buying a coffee because they like how it tastes and they just want that over and over and over again, right? Like that's their basic approach. So maybe it's less customer focused in that sense, but if you're buying a coffee because you liked a particular note in it, my role or my goal for myself has always been to overemphasize that note and to like really enjoy it and taste it. And so like if I'm buying a coffee that I really want fruitiness out of, then I'm going to shape everything that I do around trying to get that out. So when it comes to the roast timings, for me, that's all about cultivar and processing method. And so how long should I be roasting? What should my development time be? Where does first crack hit? All that sort of question comes down to the two things of cultivar and processing method. When it comes to how I'm going to approach heating that coffee, that's where I begin to consider density and moisture content in particular. moisture content is going to be a big one, because the wetter the coffee is, the harder it is going to be to push heat energy into it, because the water is going to be resisting that uptake of heat energy after you get past the boiling point. And so if you've got a really wet coffee, you're going to have to push it a fair bit harder, especially in the middle of the roast, to get to the timings that you want. Whereas if it's a drier coffee, you might actually have to lay off on it quite a bit. So knowing your moisture content is incredibly important. So whether you're getting that from the people you're buying the greens from, whether you're buying your own moisture meter, something along those lines, it's really crucial to kind of know what your moisture content is. That's also going to impact your weight loss percentage too. Just kind of throwing this out here as a thing. So, if you're, generally for weight loss for lighter roasted coffees, I'm aiming for about 1 to 2% above my moisture content. And so, if I'm roasting a coffee that's a 10% moisture content, I'm expecting 11 to 12% weight loss. If I get a coffee in that's a 12% moisture content and I bought it, I'm happy with it, I like it, my light roast is going to be a 13 to 14% weight loss on it because of the additional moisture content. So, those things that's one of the reasons it's really important to know moisture content. And so that's going to really kind of deal with how you're applying the heat energy to it. Density is a really tough one. I think density kind of can tell you a little bit about quality. If it's a really nice, dense coffee, it's probably a better quality coffee, generally speaking. And if the density is significantly lower, then it might be worth looking at how you're applying heat energy and being a little bit more careful.
Yeah.
In terms of not applying too much heat too quickly. So much of the coffee that we work with in specialty coffee, we're just lucky, and it's all so dense already that I wouldn't pick density apart too hard. It's like, oh, well, this one's 1,200 grams per liter and this one's only 1,190 grams per liter. It's like, no, those are both really dense coffees. It's fine.
Yeah.
And the numbers I'm using probably sound really weird. I would recommend water displacement density readings. Because that's, dry displacement readings don't account for void space where water displacement readings do. So water displacement would be the way that I would go. And you can Google that probably. But if not, I can briefly describe it too. Basically, you take a graduated cylinder, fill it with, let's get a 50 milliliter graduated cylinder, fill it to 40 milliliters, set it on a scale that can measure it to the hundredths place in grams. Start adding coffee until you displace 10 milliliters of water so that you're at that 50. And then the weight in grams for displacing 10 milliliters of volume. And then you can do the calculation to figure out how much grams per liter that particular coffee actually is in real, more of a scientific measurement. Because if something is less than 1,000 grams per liter, it's going to be less dense than water and it's going to float. So when we talk about these dry density displacement readings on coffee, we're like, oh, this is 750 grams per liter. That's not accurate. That's not the actual density of the coffee. That's the dry displacement reading. Because if it was actually 700 grams per liter, then the coffee would float in the water and not sink. So
the question is always, I'm just trying to avoid that always in order not to spoil any coffee. Or do you see any, do you have a technique with which you don't spoil the coffee because usually when you do water displacement, then you soak the coffee in water, so it's a bit.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, you only lose about 10 to 15 grams of green coffee. So I usually try to get them to grow, and if I get one to sprout, I put it in a pot and go for it. So
yeah, and then you just a small cylinder then.
Yeah, I wouldn't use too much more than a 50 milliliter graduated cylinder and only do about 10 milliliters of displacement. So you're only wasting, if it's a really dense coffee, 13 grams would be all you'd be wasting.
Okay. Okay. That's a good point. Of course, you don't need as much as you need with a dry matter. Okay, interesting. And so you said I really thought this concept is interesting. You said that you're looking for processing and cultivar when it comes to the length of the roast, and then also where first crack comes and to the phases, and then you look at heat application when it comes to density and water content. But the question is that's quite related, isn't it? Because when you're talking about the length of the roast, and it's also related to the heat application. Or do you divide it a bit more into phases that just say density is for the initial heat application and then like the time of the roast.
Yeah. I mean, I would really just think about it in terms of like, with the cultivar and the processing method, I know what timings I want, ideally.
Yeah.
And then basically I'm then looking at the density and moisture content to figure out how I'm going to get there without creating roasting defect.
Yeah.
Right. And so, based on the moisture content, like if I have a wet coffee and I've got to roast it fast because I'm like, oh, well, this one seems like it's going to work out better with a faster roasting style, I might have to increase my charge temperature. I might have to, because normally, for the most part, charge temperature for me is based on batch size.
Yeah.
And so I'm not really adjusting my charge temperature too much based on processing method. I know some people do that, like, oh, it's a natural, so I'm going to charge higher or lower.
Yeah.
That's not really my jam. For me, it's like, I'm doing this batch size, here's my charge temperature.
Yeah.
Unless I have to do a really different style of roasting. And so if I'm like, wow, I'm already kind of maxed out when I'm roasting a 10% moisture content coffee at this roasting style, and now I've got a 12% moisture content coffee, I know I'm going to have to probably preheat it a little bit hotter in order to make all that work together. Or I might have to run my airflow slightly differently in order to trap more heat energy in the drum. Something else to note too with moisture content is that it will cause the heat energy to kind of show up faster on the beans before boiling point. So before boiling point, it helps to basically carry heat energy into the coffee, and then after boiling point, because it's trying to go through phase change, it actually slows down the heat gained by the bean temp. So what you'll notice a lot of times on a wetter coffee is your turning point's going to be a little bit higher.
Yeah.
And so it's going to look like the roast is starting to run away from you. But sometimes with those wetter coffees, that's just the moisture content showing you that difference. And then it starts to really lag in the midsection.
Yeah.
And if you're not careful, people will see, oh, I'm turning too hot. They'll turn down their power settings. Then suddenly they get to the middle where everything's struggling, and then the roast is just really, really elongated.
Yeah.
And so what I would generally expect for a wetter coffee is a slightly higher turning point and then needing slightly more energy in the midsection. And so it kind of balances itself out sometimes that way.
Yeah. Okay.
So
Interesting. Yeah. Oh, that's really, really interesting. And then, so imagine now, maybe as a last question, because the hour is already nearly full.
Really?
Yeah.
Oh my gosh. Okay. Yeah. That went fast.
But imagine now I come to you as a roaster and I want to roast the fruitiest, because you said you also love fruity coffee. I want to roast the fruitiest coffee possible. So how would you now set it up? Like, which cultivar would you take, and which processing, and then which roast approach?
Yeah. Wow. I get to choose the cultivar and everything too?
Yeah. You
Okay.
everything.
I can choose anything? Wow. This doesn't normally happen. Usually when people ask this question, they're like, I have this coffee. How do I do this?
One as a cheap price.
Yeah. Well, a cheaper price, or just like, I'm stuck with this. How do I deal with it now?
Yeah.
Yeah. I, for my own personal preferences, and I got to lead by saying that. So, yeah, like I love pink Bourbon. I love Chiroso. I love, Rume Sudan.
Yeah.
These cultivars. Gesha is obviously really good too. Maragogype. I love Maragogype.
Yeah.
So let's go with that one. I'll go with Maragogype. I'm going to say, I'm going to buy a Maragogype. And if I want to really amp up the fruit, I'm probably going to buy a natural process Maragogype. We're going to live dangerously. It might even be a 24-hour anaerobic ferment. I don't know how all that stuff works. It's a really nice natural Maragogype. And I'm going to probably charge with a smaller batch size because it is a really large bean and I want to make sure it's got plenty of space. I'm probably going to run my airflow a little bit faster. And I'm going to push the roast pretty hard. I'm going to try and get to yellowing in about 4.5 minutes. I'm going to try and get to first crack at about 7.5.
Yeah.
And because it's a natural, I'm going to probably have a slightly shorter development time. So I'm thinking probably about 1 minute to 1:10.
Yeah.
Trying to keep my weight loss at about 1% above the initial moisture content, and hoping that my colors come out at about 70 whole bean and around 110 ground for espresso. That would be my jam. And then I would brew that at a 16:1 coffee to water ratio, aiming for about 18.5% soluble yield with like a 1.35 TDS on that sucker.
Ah, good.
That'd be my goal. Whether or not I could do it would be, a question.
I'm going to try it then, like next week.
Yeah. Well, you got a natural Maragogype?
It was actually, funnily, when I started, the first coffee I ever sourced, and I really loved it a lot, was a honey Maragogype from Colombia. That was such a beautiful coffee, actually. Very, like, it had, a lot of mangoes in it, and then very fruity, it was such a beautiful coffee. And unfortunately, then it was a bit difficult to source it again from the farm. And but I hope I will be able to get it to the assortment again. Yeah, it was not a natural, but it was a honey, but really beautiful coffee.
I think Maragogype is probably one of my favorite cultivars, and I think it's very underrated by most people.
Yeah.
But
Very nice. So, but if people want to read about Maragogype or other coffees, cultivars, then really have a look at the book. I think it's really, really great. There is so much information in there, then really hands-on roasting approaches where you can share also, because we've been talking really quickly about shorter and longer rows, but you say then how long the phases should be and how you would approach the coffee. So there's really a lot of hands-on information in it. Also, have a look at the other videos. I will also post it then down there that we did, because there we also shared a lot of information about roasting approaches. And but now I also want to give you the word, because if people want to know more about you, you can actually tell what you're offering, what you're doing, what they can find or get from you. So maybe how they can learn more about the airflow project.
yeah, I mean, I've got one of my favorite ways to interact with people recently has been I started a online community for coffee roasters.
Yeah.
And it's got a couple different aspects to it, but there's a book club aspect where we meet once a month, and we're going through the Book of Roasts together right now, which I believe you sell as well, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So yeah, you could get it directly from Ingo at Roast Rebels. But we're doing the Book of Roast Volume 1, and we're going through sections, and we read it and we talk about it, because so often we get these books and they just sit on our shelf as reference.
Yeah.
But we're actually going through section by section, and we're talking about how we as coffee roasters practically apply it.
Yeah.
Right now is the holiday season, and so we've had less people in attendance, but sometimes we'll have up to 11 or 14 people on for the live section of the call. But then the calls are always recorded, and so if you miss the call, you can come in the comments and rewatch it, that sort of thing. So there's a book club. I've got a coffee forum 24/7. You can ask questions about anything coffee related. Don't want life advice from me. I'm going to go ahead and say that. But coffee advice, I'm here for.
Yeah.
And then I also run a mentorship group in there, which is we meet 2 times a month for large meetings. And then I have open office hours where anyone can pop in and just talk to me about any questions that they have at any time. So the mentorship group is less than 2 hours of consulting with me. The forum is about 1 hour worth of consulting with me, and the book club is insanely inexpensive. But those online communities have been an absolute blast, and they've grown significantly. We've got a really good group of folks on there.
Yeah.
So that's something I absolutely adore. Still do online courses, teaching in person here and there as well, just kind of locally. And no current plans for new books, but I'm in the process of writing a couple. I just don't know when they're going to be able to be released, because life happens.
Good. No, but that's great. And people then really can come to you for consulting and can get really hands-on information and tips to improve their roast. And I will then put, of course, the link to your website, and then also to your social, Instagram was probably your website, your Instagram.
Yep.
And there people can find you. And then, of course, also the link to the book. And besides that, I just can thank you for everything that you're doing for the coffee industry, for the coffee world, your research, all the different researches you have done so far and you're still doing, and then also for taking your time for this interview.
No, it's my pleasure. And honestly, this is the stuff that makes me feel alive. Figuring out things and learning things and tasting new coffees is the whole reason I'm in it. So yeah, awesome. It's very invigorating.
Good. Thank you, Rob. And hope to see you soon.
Yeah, sounds good. Hopefully not quite 3 years till next time, right? So